Good afternoon, friends. Stephen Benoon here with Israeli News Live. It is December the 15th, 2025, and I've got a very good friend here. I say a good friend, we're more acquaintances. We've been on John Moore's program a number of times there, Steve O'Neill, and I so value his input. His insights are just impeccable. Uh, many of you guys are probably thinking Owen Wilson is on the program right now by his picture here because they have such a striking similarity, and I'm sure many of you would probably be sitting there scratching your head later, going like, "Gosh, I know that guy, but his name's not Steve O'Neill." Well, it is. So, anyway, Steve, thank you for joining me today, and you are a one of the most valuable people I know of, and I know that John Moore on his website he does uh, share a lot of your work that you write about on there, and that's thelibertyman.com. Are you still writing and putting post over there?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Nice to be with you. I have not actually, to be honest with you, any type of information I've been getting lately, other than the alt media material from Napolitano and Nima Al-Rashid and neutrality studies and Mark Armstrong. Other than that, I've been getting information that's actually been confidential. And so, I have not been submitting it to John. It's been private.
I can understand that, and I do have some folks there that are doing some digging on that subject as well, which we won't necessarily go into that part of it. But just the other day, you reached out to me and you shared some very concerning things when it comes to the European Union, uh, Ukraine, NATO, and the dangers that we are currently in. And so I just want to give you the floor and listen and just whatever information you're able to share about what you're seeing, what your concerns are. I think our audience needs to hear this, and perhaps maybe there's somebody that might give some feedback that could be of a great input as well.
Well, Steve, I got a whole not I my entire objective is not I don't sell any books, not selling wood stoves or any salt solutions to fix medical problem. This is entirely a matter of obtaining valuable information for my own decision making and those of close friends. And uh, the thing is that I have been getting information lately that a crosswind of information, actually contradictory information in some respects, that is extremely concerning. And the reason I actually got a hold of you was not necessarily to go on the air with it. In fact, some things I cannot be direct about, but we can share enough, I think, to be valuable to others. Really, what we're doing here is sharing our conversation. And I wanted to reach out to you and anyone who is in the loop to discuss certain specifics having to do with global policy, the direction that we're headed, in particular with regard to global war. Economics is another matter. It actually ties in because war is simply the final stage of certain types of economic cycles. But um, actually, we might want to cover several general subjects related to all of this, and then go into the salient issue, which has to do with the severe risk for nuclear combat, the degeneration of nuclear combat, sometime in the first half of next year, because of the complexities of what's going on. In particular, because I'm convinced that we're in a situation in which there is this a decision has been made to risk global population for the maintenance of the current power structure we'll go into that more as we discuss it and get into the specifics. And there's, I think, a tremendous misunderstanding of Russia's situation, their power and vulnerabilities, and also Ukraine's, because you know you'll see all of this propaganda about, oh, Russia's losing and they're about to go kaput, and of course Trump made a rather cavalier statement a couple several months ago. Oh well, uh, Russia's going to fall apart, and the Ukraine can take back their territory, maybe some more. And of course, Martin Armstrong and Martin Armstrong is an extremely important component in any discussion of geopolitics and economics. And those who are not familiar with him, please do get familiar with him. We can discuss that later. Armstrong actually analyzed it and said, well, it had to be a sarcastic comment. I'm not entirely sure it was. And brings up a very subtle and interesting problem that this is where the crosswinds of information are. But anyway, this misunderstanding both the cultural as well as military objectives and the background to Russia and Ukraine and what's really going on there. Misunderstanding this is at the core, I think, of the problems. I mentioned the mainstream press is full of this propaganda about, this neocons and the Europeans are all in the same bed, saying the same thing. All this propaganda. We're going to beat Russia and all this, and they're about to fall over. Whereas the alt media, and you're getting, alt media, there's a lot of junk out there. But if I had to summarize it in a few, and there are others that I'll miss, my apologies. But first of all, of course, Martin Armstrong, who wrote the Socrates AI code that actually accurately predicts global events, the class of global events. It's not a crystal ball. Then you get into Judge Napolitano, first class. And he commonly interviews Colonel Douglas McGregor, Ray McGovern, Larry Johnson, Larry Wilkerson, and he and others, such as Nima Alkashid of Dialogue Works or Neutrality Studies, I forget the gentleman's name, will also interview them and fellows like Chas Freeman, Jack Matlock, who was a diplomat, I think the last one for the USSR, between us and the USSR. And of course, in another category altogether, closer to mine, Dr. Ted Coastal of MIT, who was in defense, nuclear strategy, and so forth, and is making commentaries. And by the way, let me give a quick digression there. One of the areas that's key to my concerns is that we appear to be in a position now resembling what happened in 1998 when the Russian banking system, that whole corrupt thing involved with the American, Republic Bank of New York and so forth, so on, and Gershnovsky and so forth, it was all falling apart. Russia was financially collapsing, and there was a horrible concern about the world's largest nuclear power, disintegrating. And this appears to be the objective now between Europe and Ukraine, and we'll go into that later. But 1998 was a very critical point, but relevant to Ted Coastal is something that for past, I had to say 6 or 7 years, I've been making reference to. And it was the NATO nuclear drill called Able Archer in 1983, in which we very nearly had a nuclear war. And why is this significant? Not only because of that itself, but
You're talking about back in November of 1983, correct?
well, yes, it was about a week long. It was early November.
Right, right.
About the 4th year rounds or something. And that's when the drill was. And this is a by the way, a routine drill. This was the Reagan years. By the way, this was also right after, well, number one, the Evil Empire speech by Reagan. Number two, the Korean 007 shootdown. this situation was very tense. In 1983 was only a half a decade or so before the Soviet Union broke up. And these were old men, old communists, very paranoid about the West. And Vladimir Khrushchev, who's head of the KGB, absolutely hated the West, distrusted anything. In fact, uh, uh, Dostoevsky, who was probably best spy we ever had inside Russia. I think he was a KGB colonel. Now, there was one other fellow, it's a tip of my tongue, who gave us valuable information, missile information, right during the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. And he got found out and was executed. Gordievsky made it out by the skin of his teeth. But he gave us critical information during the Eagle Literature drill. And there was another one who gave the Russians critical information under the name of Topaz, and Rainer Rupp was his name. He was a Russian agent, I think maybe of German extraction. Rupp, I guess German, but he made it high into NATO, into their highest document, their highest operating document, which he was able to clandestinely photograph for the Russians, so they knew everything in terms of their strategy. And he was able to communicate during the drill critical information indicating that NATO was not in the least preparing for actual first strike situation with Russia.
Right.
Russians,
Now, Steve, were you thinking of Andrei Andropov as far as the Russian former KGB guy?
no, Andropov was he was the prime minister of Russia at the time. He was very ill. Um, he also was part of that old guard, communist guard that completely. He was KGB. He had been KGB.
Right,
Now,
right,
another digression. Of course, Putin was KGB. He was a low-level KGB and not all that outstanding. That was not really his shtick.
right,
Um,
right.
he came in really as that. How he came in is another discussion, but many people misrepresent him, misrepresent Putin. Andropov was the head of Russia at the time, very ill at the time, so almost out of commission. And Vladimir Khrushchev was head of the KGB and was running a. He was running it was a big board. I forget the name of it. Um, I don't speak Russian, so
And my wife can
um,
speak Russian. Do you need help, Steve?
it's called. I'd have to look it up.
Right, right,
Thing is, Steve, the Khrushchev, Gordievsky would report to Khrushchev, and of course, if he weren't saying the Americans were getting ready to blow our butts off and all these horrible things, you were given a record. So you had to play along, and all the time, Gordievsky knew that the West was not really. He knew enough about Western culture um, that he knew the West really wasn't doing this, but Khrushchev thought so, and the rest of the KGB thought so, and the Kremlin thought so. This is really there's so many facets to this that it becomes a giant digression in conversation. But the key point I want to make, and we can add to it here and there, is that by the time that drill was over, first of all, there was a fellow in a missile command, the Russian missile command, who made a decision to ignore several launch indications from the Russian satellites that monitor silos. Turned out that the sun happened to hit cirrus clouds at a special angle and it hit the spectrum, which suggested a missile bloom in our silos, and a handful of them ultimately happened. If he ignored them, canceled it, finally called Kremlin, the command of Garkov. I never heard it was running at the time. It wasn't Garkov, but the thing is that they eventually dismissed him for doing that, and he may have saved the world from, because they were already ready on the trigger with the checkers ready to go. They were scared to death that we were going to launch a first strike. that right there, that statement has a bunch of background to it too. It takes all the way back to Curtis LeMay. Anyway, the thing is that getting back to the point I'm really trying to make is that in the end of all of this, when Reagan was debriefed after this all was over, and when the KGB and Andropov were debriefed, the KGB and the CIA realized they didn't know squat about each other. The KGB, and I remember a discussion about this, is very good at collecting information, gobs of information.
Yes, they are.
Not very damn good at analysis. They misunderstand Western psychology because they really are not as deeply invested in. I think they're better now, but they weren't then. And to me, at the same time, the CIA is not half as smart as it thinks it is. Because I think the guys inside know most of what they do doesn't work, but that's the nature of the problem. They still do good work in some areas, but the CIA did not understand the Russians worth a damn, because if they did, and if the think tanks did, and certainly if MI6 did, they wouldn't have pulled that off like they did, knowing that the Russians would have their hands on the trigger. The reason, these agencies aren't half as good as they think they are, and that means the Americans, the Russians have not understood each other halfway as well, even a quarter way as well as they should. And B, we have a situation in which there is a fundamental distrust between the Russians and the West that has existed for a long time, partly because the paranoia of Stalin. This goes into a whole bunch of going a whole PhD thesis discussing all of these different things. So I'm sure there's Rand Corporation is full of them, but we did not understand the mentality of the Russian. This is what Gordievsky was able to at least give us some indication of at the last moment before somebody made a big mistake. If it weren't for him, I think it would have been very bad. And also Topaz, Reiner, he did get caught in jail for a while and released. He doesn't regret what he did, but he was able to give the Russians some indication that we were not getting ready to launch, because they did not know. And this gets back to one other point, besides the fact that our intelligence agencies are not nearly as good as they need to be in certain respects.
It's always, Steve. It's always you when you have really good ones that work in there. There's always somebody trying to railroad them. And by the way, it was Petrov, I believe, was the Russian that you were talking about that actually judged that as a false alarm and did not escalate.
Yeah, that's who it was. But the other issue is that, first of all, we don't have to necessarily like the Bolsheviks or their culture or their country. But when you disrespect them routinely, it creates a problem diplomatically and much deeper. We see here again, you remember the issue that George Patton had during the war, and he was, Marshall had to hang up on him. What was his name? Beetle Smith was talking to, I think, on an open line. And he's talking about going ahead and marching against the Russians. And of course, we were already had a very sensitive situation with Stalin, which this is partly why Patton was admonished to some degree, maybe killed. But we had a situation in which, for this long time, the Russians have always been treated like a stepchild. And this was repeated during the Reagan Evil Empire speech, which really irritated Moscow, because they had the whole time, especially because of Britain. Keep in mind, another digression, when Churchill sent a letter to Stalin warning him that the Germans were about to invade, which they did under Barbarossa, he ignored it because he didn't trust Churchill. Because a lot of people didn't trust Churchill, but the point is that distrust is deeply rooted and long-standing. And after the war, the whole Cold War, was exacerbated by Reinhard Gehlen, who was Hitler's security guy, and got job security by overstating the Russian threat, even though there was one. But he worked with OSS, which became CIA, and then made it much worse than it needed to be. And then, during that same period, or following it, we developed the atomic bomb as fast as we could, and we're in a position in the late 40s, before the Russians had the bomb, to exercise what LeMay was suggesting, was to fly about 130 B-29s over Russia and bomb them into the Stone Age so they couldn't build the bomb. This went to Congress. They were horrified, of course, as anybody would be. It did not fly, but we have maintained, and this is important, and this feeds back into the other discussions, we have maintained a posture of potential first strike against Russia the whole damn time, and still have it.
Well, that's why General Patton wanted to do that in the early years
Well,
there.
sure he did. Yes, absolutely he did. This was before the bomb, not much before, but before.
Right.
He knew the big enemy was Russia. It really wasn't, but he understood. He was French. The French and the Germans, and the Brits, they've always been fighting, they've always been fighting the Bolsheviks. This is a European war that never seems to end. World War I, World War II, and World War III will be an extension of it. That's coming real soon. Thing is how do we break that pattern spiritually and sociologically? That's the resolution to get to after we've gone through all of this miserable discussion about why it's happening. But posture of first strike by the West has been something, never mind the fact that we treat the Russians like stepchildren the whole time. Reagan did the Needle Empire speech, which did not help, reflected our arrogance and our view of them when at a time when we had an opportunity to, purchase at a very reasonable price fertilizer, gas, oil, uranium, diamonds, and timber at very good prices and build our economy up, and Russia's at the same time, which, remember the previous summer, I was saying before the election, we should be making an ally out of Russia, not an enemy.
Exactly. Yes. I
Come
mean,
people,
you drove that point in extremely well, but the problem is everybody in politics is determined to make Russia an enemy. And
are owned by the political system. And
yes,
thing is, Steve, you know, the
APAC, I
world,
think, is determined, Steve, to drive us to war with Russia, hell or high water.
the mechanism that we'll get into in a second, because it's very specific. And this, both Ukraine and Russia are victims of a process in old world order Europe.
Yes.
And the planet is governed or run by the competition between a few who are maintaining their power, and the rest prefer to act like animals, like livestock, not do anything about it. And what's interesting in this perspective, in that rather unpleasant perspective, occasionally a visionary falls between the cliff of the elite, and of course they come down and bring us some interesting hope in a lot of trouble usually. But the real issue is that the old world power in Europe understands that if nothing else, they comprehend the Socrates results. They've known it, I think, in general, because Europe's been running rogue for a long time. The United States of Europe, otherwise known as the Eurozone, doesn't work. And Armstrong, when they consulted him in '98, told them it wouldn't work because they're not solving their bond problem. In other words, they didn't probably assign debt equities. And so the Euro's failing. They also have no natural resources. Russia has gods. This whole idea of breaking down Russia, stealing their natural resources, and restoring old world order power and maintaining it is the whole object of using Ukraine to weaken Russia to disintegrate them. The real issue ultimately is China, because that's where global socioeconomic power is going. China, India, Russia, but the East. They're trying to prevent this. They're shoveling shit against the tide, put it directly.
Exactly.
It's not going to work. Armstrong knows it, and anybody who analyzes knows it. I think we've got a self-delusion at the top of the world. Never mind these people. I mean, if we want to go into the adrenochrome child blood sacrifice discussion, we can. I think it's a little out of scope, for right now. But Ronald Bernard, former banker, got hired. That's a discussion some other time or later. That's another long discussion too about how the world power, how deranged it really is. But that derangement is an important dimension of the problem we need to talk about right now, and that is that I think there is a collective self-delusion on the order of what the Third Reich did going on in Europe and among the neocons advising, Trump. On top of that is another parallel dimension having to do with religious fanaticism. This comes out of, there's a discussion about, does the United States control Israel or will Israel control the United States? The United States controls Israel. Israel is a projection of the United States policy. However, there is a contingent of religious fundamentalist agenda, which does not, in my view, see things rationally. It has a doctrine which, in some ways, could be viewed as, suicidal.
Yes. Very
And
true.
is reaching in through APAC and other, and this here again, let me get something straight. And you and I, Steve, have addressed this, we've touched upon it before. You know how I feel about Israel, and that is this, that I believe that a Judeo-Christian prejudice in their own right in behalf of a Jewish homeland or a Judeo-Christian homeland is it's not an unreasonable thing in the scheme of things, the way this planet works. I think it makes sense. I think we should have a protected area. And the United States has plenty of missiles to do that if it really had to make a point. We don't need is religious fundamentalism in the form of Greater Israel or Zionism, or for that matter, evangelical Christianity, thinking that it has a franchise on God's word and is ready to march the whole world into the apocalypse because they think that's going to bring their redemption. Sorry, I don't buy it, and a whole lot of other people, most of the billions of the rich people in the world don't buy it here.
Neither do I.
In the scriptures, it doesn't mean there isn't merit protecting Israel. I think there is. However, first of all, let's get this straight. The state of Israel is a product of the effort to get the United States into World War I and ultimately II. A deal was made. England more or less had control of the Middle East along with the United States. And we had the power and exercised it to draw arbitrary borders, and so we made Israel. And we made it as a part of a payment to get the United States in. And I don't know all the details, but the state of Israel per se is a product, a secular arrangement, and nothing to do with God's chosen tribe or anything definite of that sort. And the thing is that idea of an Israeli homeland is very reasonable. In my humble opinion, I don't have a problem with it. But the execution of American policy hegemony to encircle Russia, maintain its power, even despite economic cycles, at the risk of nuclear war, is unacceptable. Unfortunately, I don't see this degree of sophistication in our State Department to express, discuss, fireside chat, and express it in foreign policy. I see something very different. This is getting us into very serious trouble. Now, that's the religious side of the argument, and that's not even a religious or military tactical talk or even economic talk. This is just ideology. Religion has more blood on its hands than any other thing in this world. That doesn't mean religion is great. It just means that our our doctrines and our organized religions are not doing a very good job, in my opinion. Rather ironic.
I completely agree. There's some articles, Steve, I'll have to send you that I've written recently on that. Like, for example, where they continually misquote Genesis 12, saying, "Whoever blesses Israel, God will bless. Whoever curses, it'll be cursed." And I'm like, they
Yeah,
don't even read. I mean, you don't have to know Hebrew to know that it doesn't say that, but they
right.
keep trying to apply it to the modern state of Israel. And, it's like my wife said one time. She said, Israel exists. She said, there's Jewish people that have been born there. Do they have a right to be there? Sure, they do. But do they have a right to genocide Gaza and the Palestinians in the West Bank? Absolutely not. You know, I mean, it's unfortunately it's really turned into chaos. And and I'm thinking too, when we're talking about Ukraine, one thing that came to mind and I'm sure you're very familiar with all of this, but if you look at Bolivia with Evo Morales in 2019, he's basically thrown out of the country. I had some folks that contacted me down there that were journalists had been living there, and they were telling me how great the man was and how he had really done some wonderful things for that country and helped the indigenous people. But because he was an indigenous guy, and he gets thrown out. But there's one thing in common with him, Nicolas Maduro, and that of Muammar Gaddafi. Every one of them criticized Israel, depending on what was going on in Israel at that time. Every one of them cared about their own people and making lives better for their people. Like Gaddafi had made the river of water for the Libyans. He gave the oil revenue back
Yeah,
to the people. Maduro is, now Trump's talking about going over there and wanting to take them out and blow them into
yeah.
oblivion.
Punk.
Right. I mean,
That's
it's
that's
stupid though,
that's
right? Steve, when I worked with the CIA, we were dealing with Nicaragua at the time, and we were working to trying to, to arm the Contras there, overthrow the government there. And at the same time, we were facilitating, which I did not know this part of it until later. It dawned on me. We were just helping protect all the drug cartel money coming into the United States and get everybody get their kickbacks. I mean, I should have known from those days, but I was too naive. Uh, but even in the case of Maduro with Venezuela, I'm like, somebody was, they were telling Steve, you don't believe that the guy's a drug lord, and I'm like, well, maybe he is. I said, but the problem is he's just not paying his bills. If he is paying his bills, they would probably not bother him. So, you know,
this whole drug thing, Steve, with Venezuela. That's a that's a for pretext. It's a other baloney. We are interested in securing, even though it's low grade, that oil revenue.
oil, exactly.
Um, and that's especially, see, I'm suspicious that the operational factor is that we expect to have completion of the war with Iran, that it's not going to be trivial. The Strait of Hormuz and so forth will be closed, that we need to make sure that we've got a long-term access to a reasonable supply of oil, if it is high sulfur. And I think that's what's really going. Not to mention the fact that we still have a Monroe Doctrine view, and that Russia and China have been in there, and so there's a lot of them beneath the surface. But Venezuela is a gigantic Vietnam, Afghanistan risk in our own hemisphere. It's going to become our own Ukraine, so to speak. And um, I think it's. I don't. I'm not sitting in the State Department. I don't know all the background of this. I see enough very concerned about it, and I think, you know, Mr. Peace is about. I think he's ticked off three-quarters of the planet,
Yes.
and you know, I don't enjoy being critical of President Trump. I wish I knew him. I wish I could advise him. The first thing I tell him is, listen, it's time to fire three-quarters of your staff. But
Amen.
listen, for the election, right before, he already, you know, actually during the summer before the election, I think you might even recall me saying on here, look, Trump needs to get his ex-com together because we don't have a president right now. Right. And he needs to go ahead and secure this issues within the limits of stretching maybe, but within the limits of his authority. But he needs to get these people solving problems in advance and make connections with Russia because Europe, that whole neocon structure says don't talk to the enemy, which is the stupidest thing you can do. Stop to, especially when you talk with somebody like Russia. And that's what they do, though. I think the first 3 weeks that Trump was in, he did not talk to anybody over there in Russia. And I was wondering why. Even Martin Armstrong wondered, why isn't Trump calling me? And calling him because he's some of the best advice around on this, and they knew each other. And I think the neocons got in on him and said, "Don't talk to anybody. And they indoctrinated him at the beginning of the year."
Yes.
And so that's a whole other discussion there. During the summer, I said, "Listen, we should be getting these ex-com together. We've got a serious problem that could become a world war under adverse circumstances, which we're approaching." And then we got Gorka, Waltz, and Kellogg. Oh my God, come on! All they did was make amateurish inflammatory remarks about Russia. Is this the way? It's like, is this the way Trump's going to kick this thing off? Is to piss off Russia? My God, Putin is a reasonable man. I don't care what anybody says. We don't have to agree with his policy in every respect. He's the he's the most level-headed person out there right now in terms of heads of state. Um, it's anyway, this was going on, and it's just like, my God, we get into the inauguration, and it's like a vacuum. It's, well, why isn't anything happening? What happened to peace in 24 hours? Well, okay, maybe a month, but you've got to talk to them. And it dawned on me later, and I said, well, you know, I have fish to fry. I have things to do. I can't worry about foreign policy too much. But if I did, I'd be in the middle of this thing. Mr. President, sir, I've at least courtesy call the papers, open up a positive diplomatic thing before we meet. What the hell was he doing? I don't know. Talking
Well,
about,
you just like you said, Steve, he's got all these, neocons in there that are directing him what he's going to do, what he's going to say, where he can go, and who he can speak to. And like you said too early on, presidents are only figureheads. They really don't run the country. They're just figureheads and they're actors and puppets for whoever else is running the country.
well, they reason something like terrorists. What's going on there? That's somewhat of a digression. I even Armstrong is somewhat. He's not exactly an apologist, but he has pointed out that there had been some, I think, misplacement of blame against tariffs for certain situations. However, he does say, that, well, Trump's tariffs are probably effective in certain respects, but I've had a more dour view of it. I've made that point, and that I think that the judicious use of tariffs in certain specific strategic situations in which you have to protect a critical industry from market instability, I think a tariff makes sense. But to use them copiously as foreign policy, first of all, what's a tariff? Who pays it? It's a sales tax. It's a federal sales tax. The public pays it, not the government. You put a tariff on Chinese goods, Americans pay for it, not the Chinese. Of course, it's intended to reduce trade. First of all, if it had been me, if I'd been in the White House, what would happen? I'd say, look, what we need to do is shift tariffs. In other words, not increase them. I'd say, well, why can't we tariff a particular country's production, but make sure that we can get it cheaply over here so that we don't have to burden the American public who's already facing inflation? I would handle things. Now, maybe that isn't always possible, but I personally think that tariffs are, the idea of reindustrialization of the United States is noble in at least a traditional sense. In fact, organically, I think, well, we need to be able to do this ourselves and not be at the mercy of foreign, production, but because we are a large, rapidly integrating planet as a whole, we have to look at things from this other than what is called the perspective of mercantilism. Mercantilism, for example, Germany is strong in mercantilism. Mercantilism, it means to produce everything inside their country and then sell it. That's the meaning of it. And in principle, it sounds great. You're the guy making it all and you sell it. But it turns out that real economic power comes from your consumer buying power. So it turns out that there is a balance between production, mercantilism, and you would call that consumerism. Too much of either one in your country is to economic instability. This is not generally addressed, certainly not by Trump, but it's something that is it's a more sophisticated, subtle issue, socioeconomic issue, but it's nonetheless a major problem for us because all we've done is severely increase prices at a time when we've already gone through the COVID inflation, and we're going to get more. Even though, well, oil in the Asian markets were down today, and we've got a lot of issues. Gold and silver up. Why? Because war is coming.
Well, let me
Uh,
ask you this, Steve, though. Don't you think, too, another thing that's really crippled our economy is all the billions of dollars we keep sending Israel? And granted, I am I can't be neutral any longer. I mean, I was born Jewish. I was a strong supporter of Israel for many, many years, and it's only been mainly. Well, one, I woke up that the whole Schofield Zionist Darby theology is what really brainwashed America.
yeah,
So I woke up to that issue there. But actually, what really kind of helped wake me up was the situation in Syria back when, especially when the bomb goes off, kills all these little kids and stuff, and the women, sarin gas, and they blame it on Assad. And then I'm watching Aaron Erdem over in Turkey, who is he was an MK member at the time, and he's standing there before the parliament, and he is laying out how that. The sarin gas was smuggled into Turkey, and that it was the very same guy now, Erdogan, that's in power. Back then, I think he was a prime minister early in his younger years, and was working with the U.S. CIA to smuggle that sarin gas in, give it to ISIS, and they'd captured him, and
yeah,
they had him in prison. And Erdogan says, "Let him go." So then I'm like, "Wow." Hello, Syria. It's not Bashar al-Assad. It's the problem. I'm sure he's got his own issues, but who's really doing this? And I was sitting there, Steve. I was sitting there at the time, sitting at dinner one night up in around the Sea of Galilee area there with a friend of mine who was an officer in the IDF. And he's telling me, he says, Steve, he said, the weirdest thing. He says, ISIS militants, we've got pictures of these ISIS militants wearing tzitzit, and that's, you don't know what it is, Steve, the four tassels on the garment there. And he said, they're Jewish. And I said, what? And I was so pro Zionist at the time, right? And I'm like, what the heck are we doing over with ISIS? He says, I don't know. All I can tell you is I know this. I'm an officer. I know what's going on. And so it's like you begin to wake up, you realize that there's a major issue. And then, of course, you got Wesley Clark saying that we're going to go to war, take down seven nations in 5 years. Well, it's taking us, what, I don't know, about 35 years instead, or 25 years, whatever the case may be. But all we're doing is we're wasting all
well,
the American resources on fighting these wars. And finally, you get
yeah,
somebody like, you know, uh, uh, Marjorie Taylor Greene that at least has the kudos to go in there. She's got more cojones than any man I've seen in politics and stand up, fight this thing. But then, President Trump talks about hanging them all for treason. I mean, it's like, what has happened to our politics here?
well, listen, there is a there is a foundation to all of this. Whether you're talking the Israeli, whether it's the Syrian, the Iraqi, or Iranian, any of that across North Africa, or Ukraine, um, it all has the common denominator of a central control mechanism that is, well, it's in London and New York and Brussels and and the banking system. Of course, you have Zurich and you have the Vatican as well. And these powerful families project, they maintain these conflicts in order to maintain control. The thing is that Israel was formed amongst, as a state, among this symphony of, it's too pretty a name for it, but the symphony of conflict. And the problem is that, here again, half truths are one of the most powerful weapons in the world. But the idea of the Israeli homeland, and really it's Judeo-Christian homeland, um, I think even if it is not necessarily entirely egalitarian in nature, the world doesn't run entirely egalitarian. I think it's still very reasonable. I think that we have a right to have some prejudice in that regard, as long as it does not maintain um, imperialism against the Arab states. It has to simply be there on its own right, and then we have to solve the inequities, and we don't solve them by doing things like they're doing in the West Bank or Gaza. And the other thing is, I think we need to distinguish Israeli foreign policy from Jewish philosophy. They're not related.
Exactly, exactly, and that's why there was this big fight to overthrow the judicial reform. And another thing too, Steve, the whole idea, the concept of Judeo-Christian value, there's really not a true marriage of Judeo-Christian value, because what's happened is in Israel, what runs Israel is a Pharisaic, just like what Jesus condemned 2,000 years ago. He didn't condemn the Jewish people, but he did condemn that Pharisaic ideology of Talmudic beliefs. And I think that's where the two are separated when it comes to that. I mean, yes, you can support the Jewish people, help them be a state, help them to have peace with their neighbors. I mean, when I lived over there, Steve, one of the most horriblest things that I ever heard, and it really, I was too hardened at the time. I mean, I have to admit, Steve, I did not like Palestinians. I mean, to the point of almost hatred, because I didn't know any better. But yet when I started meeting Palestinians and started getting to become friends with them, I'm like, gosh, well, they're just human beings like anybody else. I mean, most all the ones that I knew were secular, and they didn't have any axe to grind. They just were trying to survive.
There's no time for a lot of people in this world to get to know each other. I think that
Exactly.
this is the
That's all
problem
we
with
need.
Americans. This is why we almost blew each other up several times, and I'm getting ready to again. Um, here again, you and I are not so naive to suggest, oh, let's all just say we need to have a loving world and all get along and everything will be fine. Of course, it's difficult.
Right.
Of course, listen, Eastern Europeans have a very long memory. This is partly why we have a problem between Ukraine and Russia. Now, the war between Ukraine and Russia did not start with their conflict. It started with from Europe. It started from Western Europe and deciding to take advantage of the fact that Ukrainians and Russians are different cultures, really, even though there's overlap. But there's something else I want to point out, and this was pointed out to me by Ukrainians. We sometimes when we're discussing solutions to the Ukraine war, and we really ultimately all these discussions ultimately, how much I chastise John and Dave Rogers all the guys who sit around drink this damn coffee and never solve any problems, and I get really irritated with it, and I really do. But the thing about Ukraine is that first of all, we can argue that, well, those eastern provinces, the Donbass, etc., maybe Crimea, um, are principally Russian, and that this whole thing since the Minsk agreements, the persecution of the Russians by the Western Ukrainians support, suggests that should have gone and should go to Russia anyway. If there's something deeper here, and that is that those areas were not predominantly Russia if you go back far enough. They were a mixture of these tribes and groups that of this eclectic area called Ukraine, which really wasn't a nation, but it was an area that the Russians settled in there primarily during the Soviet era. In a similar way, that the Jews from New York and elsewhere settled the West Bank. And this is a very important argument because what it does, it says, well, you can't simply make a facile statement and say, well, that's really mostly Russian anyway, so we ought to just take it from Ukraine and be done with it. Well, that's just a little bit too easy because I wish it were true, but a lot of people would. But we need to appreciate the fact that there are complexities, cultural long-term complexities to this problem. And this is being overlooked in the case of Israel and for the Arabs, and in the case of Russia and Ukraine. And until there is a more sophisticated appreciation of cultural causes, not this damn issue of how do you militarily solve it? Forget that. We need to stop the problem, not simply cover it up. And until we have that, we're going to have this war until, of course, it goes nuclear. That's where we'll eventually have to discuss that danger.
And we're coming dangerously close, Steve, to that. Very dangerously.
All right. Now, there are things I have my notes in here. A situation resembling concerns of 1998 arise, and there are several that I have marked with the C in parentheses, which is confidential. I can't say over on the air, but I can generalize. Are we ready to really discuss the Ukraine Russia conflict directly? Yeah, of course we touched on the causes, which have to do with, and this is an important thing. There has been since since for 100 years, there's been a general antipathy toward Russia by the West. It stressed itself both in World War I and especially in World War II as it developed into the Cold War. And as nuclear weapons developed, the issue of first strike became an issue. It became a problem. And so we've been in an implicit circumstance in which the Russians have legitimately built the likelihood of first strike on our part, where we are cavalier about it. Oh, no, we're not going to do that. But in reality, I think it was a little more dangerous than even the more optimistic people were suggesting. And we've been going into this Ukraine conflict, plus the fact that at the end of World War II, the United States held 70% of the world's gold, and virtually all of its economic power. And we had to rebuild Europe, we had to rebuild Japan. The rest of the world, Russia had to rebuild, and it was rough. And so we started stealing a lot of resources from Africa, South America, and there was, of course, the Marshall Plan and all of this and that, and a tremendously cold relationship with Russia. And this went all the way up through the Reagan era, and we, of course, the Berlin blockade, the missile crisis, and then Able Archer, and there are other less known examples. We narrowly missed nuclear conflict, and so narrowly that when you know that what happened, and almost happened, it was the sheer luck, dumb luck, that there was not a nuclear launch of some sort. I'll give you an example, a couple of them. During this crisis, the Russians had nuclear tipped, at least some had one nuclear tipped torpedo. That would be somewhat inconvenient for, say, a carrier task force. Would blow it out of the water. Now, we almost ran over a Soviet sub because we were trying to make a point, and things were very tense with their ships and our ships in the same area. That's dangerous. And Kennedy knew it, and we almost ran over one of their subs. He dulled and decided not to do anything about it. Anderson's U-2 got shut down after we had already resolved that any single thing happens, we'll go ahead and launch the invasion of Cuba. What if we had 240,000? Guess what? We didn't know a thing about the dozen Luna facilities. Lunas were, I think, 25-kilometer short range, kiloton range bombs, rockets that would have absolutely decimated our invasion force if we had launched, which we were. The only thing that stopped it is Kennedy saying, "Wait a minute, we're not yet." And if we had launched, uh, then our invasion force would have been gone, and we would have had no choice but to immediately take LeMay's bombers and vaporize Cuba. Now, what's interesting is Kennedy asked, I think it was Marshall, the head of Joint Chiefs, who was the only military he had on the EXCOM. He asked, "Well, listen, if we bomb those missile sites, can you guarantee that we get them all?" He said, "I can guarantee that we can get most of them." That meant, there were 42 missiles, of which 36 had warheads, and those were 1 to 2 megaton warheads. The Southeast would have been hit. Several cities would have been gone. He was not willing to do that for that and risk of that because several of them would have made it off. Once you get out of the boost phase, boost phase is about 2 minutes, and then it's ballistic. And it's not that far, to hit our Southeast from Cuba, Washington, New York. They could also hit all the way up anything. Portland and Seattle were a place they couldn't hit. But we would have been in a nuclear war. We had about 5,000 warheads versus their 300. Most of them they couldn't deliver. It would have been horrible. We were pretty close.
And Steve, compared to now, though, they've got hypersonic.
It's much more dangerous. It's hair trigger in certain ways that we don't know all the ways right now. The problem is this, and it has not to do so much with I made the point with you that that accidental entry into the nuclear war is the most likely mode. It still is. However, how that accident may occur is really the subject of probably the core of our conversation, which we may finally be getting to. Really, to be honest with you, I'd rather be talking about those interesting rock bands over in Ukraine that can come over here and visit. And by the way, the Russians have some really good music and some interesting people. We should all be getting together and having a good time, do some serving, have some pina coladas and enjoy each other. That's what we should be talking about.
Yes.
If the other issue should be settled, it needs to be settled. The problem is the following. I mentioned the crossroads information coming in about Russia's capabilities and situation in Ukraine's, and that there are contradictions in this, and there are very unnerving contradictions. When you look at what may be really going on, I have to speak from a position of some degree of naivete because I'm not in on this, but I have to do what's called the Gaussian, the surface integral. In other words, you can determine a lot of what's inside by integrating over the surface thoroughly and analyzing it. And you can, many times, information that's this complex and intermingled, interrelated, is holographic. Scriptures are holographic. You don't need to read them all to understand the gist of the meaning of what they're after, although there are other specifics in addition. The holography of this is a more sophisticated way, a more intelligent way to actually analyze and understand. It's nonlinear, but what it does, it gives you a much more advanced way to cut to the chase of what's really going on and what should you do about it with incomplete information. Turns out you can get quite a bit. Anyway, the problem is this, that we have a situation in which Europe, the heads of state, Starmer, Marz, Macron, particularly, they're the principals, absolutely are refractory about dealing with Russia and doing away with Russia. And yet we're getting information saying that, the Ukraine war is lost. Zelensky's, it's going to be kaput. And how do you reconcile this? Well, this is interesting. One could very quickly suggest that what we have is a Hitlerian self-delusion. Essentially where the Third Reich was in 1944-45, and entertaining a similar result. And I think to a large extent that's actually true. There's more to it. In my information coming out of Ukraine has much more strategic depth. And I think if you go over to Napolitano and you talk to McGregor, McGovern, Johnson, Wilkinson, those fellows all are in agreement that Ukraine has pretty much had it, that we're in the final throes of it. And I very much appreciate their position on this. I think they've done a very smart analysis. These guys are first class. But I think there's something that neither they nor Armstrong nor our State Department necessarily fully understands. Number one, the cultural situation, both in Russia and in Ukraine, instabilities and stabilities. Where are these? First of all, the degree I can discuss it, the capability, the strategic depth of Ukraine to sustain a long conflict on a guerrilla warfare basis is rather substantial, especially west of the Dnieper River.
You believe that Ukraine could sustain a guerrilla? Well, yeah, I guess in a guerrilla warfare situation, yes.
I know some things. I know how well armed they are. I cannot discuss it.
Okay.
The thing is that there's also other things that are even more sensitive, having to do operations coming very soon. The regime change, yes, we're going to have Zelensky's going to be king soon, and there's going to be somebody else. Well vetted in MI6 taking over. I can't go into any more detail than that, except to say that from some channel, McGregor happened to mention, so I can mention it because he did, that Zelensky will probably be the next head of Ukraine. I have a good idea of when. I'm not going to say that, but it's rather soon.
And who's that's going to be the next head?
Zelensky, General Zelensky.
Okay.
Now, here again, this is not. I'm not speaking from the mouth. Just simply saying this is the information I got. It's likely to be true, or it's at least likely to occur. You never know, something could intervene, but that's what it looks like. And he also, you've got to consider that this war is still being run by MI6. Not Washington, not Moscow.
That's absolutely correct because when Israel was trying to under gosh, what was his name? Naftali Bennett was trying to do that peace agreement. Had Russia, had Ukrainian agreement. They were going to do a peace agreement. And then who comes waltzing into Ukraine and says, no, you're not? It was.
That was, of course, Boris Johnson.
Yes, Boris Johnson. I actually seen him one time before in person. But yes, Boris Johnson showed up, and that kind of threw me. And I'm like, Boris Johnson tells them they're not going to have a peace agreement?
He's stupid enough to go do it, just like Kamala Harris was stupid enough to go in 2 days before. Well, it happened to be 2 days before the went in. It started rattling off about Ukraine joining NATO. And then the next day, Zelensky started rattling off about acquiring nuclear weapons, which I would not do. And then the next day went in. Both of them need to crack their gums about something they shouldn't do, but it was obviously provocative because they intended to have Russia go in. This was not an invasion by Putin. Of course, the Ukrainians might feel a bit differently about it, but he only went in with 90,000 people, 90,000 soldiers in order to make a point with NATO. And he was fooled by the real agenda. I don't think he's going to get fooled again. But he did not think that he would be so stupid as to do this. Or Stalin thought that Hitler would be so stupid as to go in either. The thing is that there was like a 70-page. Putin and Zelensky had the peace agreement mostly signed, and then Boris was sent in there by MI6, and also MI6. They also went in and told them to go into Kursk. They were standing up there on the border saying, well, what should we do? And then they waited for MI6 to come in and tell them. So they did. They went in. That was MI6 doing it, not Ukrainian policy. And so, the problem is MI6 and Mossad probably will not be happy to hear, you say these things. damn it, somebody's got to tell the truth about what's going on. We got to stop this. The thing is this: there's an architecture. We're getting into the mechanics of why this war is taking place. The problem, danger, is what's coming next. This philosophy of the dissolution of Russia is refractory. I am stunned that Europe, falling apart as it is planning to dedicate huge amounts of resource money to fighting Russia. First of all, it's a put on to some degree. They just can't do it. That $350 billion of Russia's money. Of course, they won't owe it to Russia if Russia falls apart. That's the part of their strategy. But they're depending on the United States nuclear arsenal to back them up. And this is an issue that Trump has to address. That's why Armstrong says, get the hell out of NATO. And I say the same thing. We can't be afford to be drawn into this thing. Better yet, let's make it very clear to Europe so they find out they have no clothes and don't do it. But right now, as things stand, Europe is of the opinion Russia is going to, they're going to disintegrate. Now, what's interesting, it's inside Ukraine. It's the same belief. Now, I can't tell you for certain whether the Ukrainian high command is deluding itself as well, or that they know something. Now, this leads into a complex of considerations having to do with a first strike type of military strategy, and I have to dance around the C's in parentheses here. There are some assets in Ukraine being positioned in such a way that can create a very, very dicey situation for Russia. A, from the perspective of its infrastructure supplying energy, and B, its ability to defend itself.
And they're actually willing to put them in Ukraine, I see, because normally, Steve, they always do it. They do it from right. No, and I'm not talking about nukes either. But even with some of the military things that I'd followed over the last few years, they would normally have them in neighboring countries pull into Ukraine. Launch still was not being operated by Ukraine, but make it look and appear to the Russians as if it were, like if the Russians didn't already know that.
Well, most of that stuff had worked. The thing is that these are assets that the Ukrainians are building in large numbers, and they've already used it to some extent, and we've seen an example of
Yes, we have.
when bombers were hit. But this can occur, and I won't go into too much detail, but on a much more thorough scale. Now, the thing is that what this would do, now, I'm discussing this with my friends. It's like, well, look, you're not going to hit it all. I mean, it's what's going to happen afterwards. But this is the issue. This is the key.
Well, Great Britain has got a lot to be concerned about at that point, because one of the things that I'd always heard was that Russia knows full well two main key players that are involved out of the European Union, Great Britain, and they figure if they decapitate Great Britain, the United States would back off. Secondly was Germany. And I assume it's still the same main key players because they want to overthrow Russia and break it up and turn it into a bunch of vassal states.
This is the key right here. It's that there is an estimate on the part of Europeans and certainly the Ukrainians that Russia is much closer to disintegrating than most analysts realize. I cannot verify this. All I can say is there was a very resolute understanding of this possibility. Now, I will say the following. Two things. Number one, the potential to perform a decapitation in such a way that it compromises their ability to handle their codes. Number two is that there are instabilities inside Russia, which I can't go into and be specific about. But there are instabilities there, both regional and cultural, but also pertaining to some unknowns regarding the structure of the relationship between the oligarchs and some old guard Russians in the Kremlin, and that this would be a very sensitive matter for Putin. And he does run things with a very tight ship, and for obvious reasons. But the question is, does Europe and Ukraine have a proprietary operation in mind to first strike Russia, not nuclear, and in a way that would cause them to become defenseless through not only attacking facilities, but also through some operation that involves compromising heads of state. Now, I can be more specific in terms of the missile dynamics and so forth. There's some things that I can't tell you that I can tell you is that there are concerns in this regard. This is really what I wrote you about, and why we're really having this conversation. Is that this particular minutia of the problem is so horrendously what I would call reckless, certainly risky. And I'm concerned that there is a concomitant misunderstanding Russian capabilities and intentions, and a miscalculation having to do with the way this kind of warfare will go. And my bottom line, Steve, is that I think somebody's playing with fire. They're tickling the tail of the dragon when it comes to Russia's ultimate nuclear response, which they will do.
Yeah.
At some point, they will launch. And here again, this is where we go with the Ted Postings discussion of how Europe's gone. Now we
Exactly.
have to
Exactly.
something
Well,
else.
Steve, let me ask you this though. All right. Here's, without being conspiratorial sounding, and I know it's going to sound conspiratorial no matter what, right? Right. Well, here's where the problem comes in. Zelensky, I see him going out, like you said. Of course, Zelensky, he is, Zelensky took him out, what, a year ago because he didn't want, I guess he didn't like the way the war was going. But nonetheless, I could see where they take Zelensky out, replace him with this guy here, and he definitely seems more capable of running a nation than Zelensky, the little puppeteer they had in there already. But now, right, here's the conspiratorial part of this though. Israel, I've watched these, and I hate the word rabbis. I rather call them rabbits personally. But anyway, we'll just say rabbis, right? Fink, he's a very, very popular Jewish scholar there in Russia. He's very frequently on television over there. I've listened to him talking about Israel is going about carrying out blood libel wars. And he literally goes into the different factions and conflicts like in Afghanistan, over in Africa. He gets into a lot of the smaller ones and he says and he starts naming why they were paying them back. Well, I say this for one reason. I was very much involved with Chabad organization, the most political minded Jewish organization of Orthodox Jews there is in the world. And they always talked about, we're going to take America down. And could this be that they're playing this hand that is so volatile that ultimately that's what they want to have happen? They want to see America get hit, or in this case, Western Europe.
You're talking about with nuclear.
Yes.
Now, there's something that we need to interject here. In let's say 1980, 1970, we'll go back then, 1% the global nuclear arsenal that were launched would, the calculations are perhaps, there is some debate about it. We would be within a regime of what we call development of it would cause a major shift in the strange attractor that governs the metastable state of our climate. They call it nuclear winter. Now, because our arsenals are smaller, it's not as small a percentage, but still about 10%, which is a very realistic number if you're having a general conflict or even a regional conflict. Um, who knows how the United States get involved? Annie Jacobson, of course, wrote the book Nuclear War Scenario. I can't say enough good about that. I think she did a fantastic job. There are debates. Now, then there are those who disagree with her assessment in terms of the necessary outcome of the war. 17 minutes later, it's all over and you're wiped. But I think there's a high probability, there's a significant probability that she is right. And even if that's not true, even if we somehow have what you would call a limited war, let me tell you something. I think a few hundred warheads, which is, I don't think I would go get by with fewer of them unless it's just several and stops, probably create such havoc in the Northern Hemisphere. Forget markets, forget your job, forget any normality anymore. That's gone. But
Yes.
way of life may be gone too. And we're risking a use it or lose it chaotic situation, especially with regard to the United States position in this. And the fact that, there are some, you might say, occult strategies. Certainly the PSYOP contains plenty of provision to bomb the hell out of China to make sure that they aren't left standing if we wind up doing this. And it's just a very uncomfortable situation that I don't think it's worth risking, but I think they are risking it.
Yeah.
No, any kind of nuclear situation. Now, there is a whole spectrum of considerations. Let me tell you that, if I've explained to my Ukrainian friends, okay, this is what you need to do. If you want to make nuclear weapons, this is sort of the things you need to consider, but I didn't want to go too thorough. I really don't want to help them build a bomb and get a war going. But the thing is that, for example, if we really wanted to destroy China, it's what you do is you build a device that's very similar to the neutron bomb. Sam Cohen's bomb, they got rid of it. It really would have been if you got to call something a nuclear weapon appropriate, the interesting thing about it is it's a fission fusion type small device that is probably more resembles the suitcase nuke concept, which means lots of tritium, and it's designed to produce primarily a fusion, convert to as much fusion output power as possible. And what's interesting here is that if you can go into some of the advanced concepts where you develop what's called an autocatalytic thermonuclear detonation wave, which does not require the plutonium spark plugs downstream, you can get up to quite a large yield in pure fusion. Now, some modification of that is possible, and then what you do, if we had to deal with the situation, and there's a corollary for the Orishnik missile, which I alluded to back on John's show. I don't want to necessarily create this thing. We can talk about it now, but what you do is you take a thermonuclear detonation wave, and instead of using a uranium tamper, you use a beryllium cobalt tamper. Beryllium causes a reduction in yield, which is probably a part of the neutron bomb concept. I think it's still classical. Haven't seen it. I can't see it. I can only design it myself. It came down to it. The thing is that what you do is the beryllium is a neutron multiplier that has an endothermic property. That is, that it reduces the total energy output of the bomb noticeably, but increases neutron output, which is useful for the the lithium-6 deuteride reaction, which is principally what's used in our bombs. The thing is that if you add the cobalt 59, all those tremendous number of fusion neutrons produce gobs of cobalt 60. They call that in its various forms the doomsday weapon. What it is, cobalt 60 has some number of years, that was a 5-year half-life. It would this is the funny thing about it. It's not funny, but um, if you're going to wage nuclear warfare on another country, if you do not want to do it yourself, you can use some variants of the neutron bomb, or you can use low altitude to low yield cobalt beryllium bombs that just utterly devastate salt country. But at low altitude, at low yield, Hiroshima up to maybe 50 or 100 kiloton, the, the cloud does not go significantly into the stratosphere. It tends to blow in the lower troposphere. That's why, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they didn't that terribly high, whereas your megaton hydrogen bombs, we go really high and go in the stratosphere and linger. Their tremendous thermal output causes tremendous burning. There's more energy coming from the secondary burning, depending on where you are, under the bomb than the bomb's yield itself.
And I've always heard that the cobalt was very, very powerful bomb.
I'm not suggesting it is. Just
Right.
telling you there are strategies that could include
Do,
this if
do
you want to
you
really get
know? Do you know that in the catacombs of the Vatican they actually have cobalt bombs that were taken there during the days of World War II from the Germans?
this is, of course, a cobalt-laced thermonuclear device. It's not just a. What was that? There was something that the Vatican had
That
in order to
that
blow
that
up.
was I got that information actually from a good friend of mine. His grandfather was a German scientist, and he helped develop the cobalt bomb under the Germans. And according to him, they perfected it. And he said, but when they saw that they were going to lose the war, though that a lot of the advanced technology they had developed was taken to Rome and hidden underground there.
Well, the Vatican and the Red Line, of course, was a tremendous asset. Zurich, Switzerland was. Um, in fact, there still is. Uh, that's when you talk about the neo-Nazi element, which is kind of a sensitive subject. Here, what I find ironic is that Israel supported Ukraine against Russia, and Ukraine is the seat. Well, this is here again. One has to be very careful in their understanding what's really going on in terms of the post-German association of the Azovs and so forth, because
Yes.
they aren't Hitlerian. There are some runes that they use, and there's some appreciations of their German associations. Um, I think it needs further study, but I Putin objects to this neo-Nazi element. I'm not so sure that he didn't maybe state it. Um, that's not really the principal issue between the Ukrainians and the Russians. There's a much deeper cultural divide there, although they share much in common and many people in common. Um, the Ukrainians have a strong sense of identity, national and cultural identity that's separate from Russia, and vice versa. In spite of that overlap, and this is part of understanding the solution. Um, we're solving things on military terms, and this let's make a deal thing. Whether you're talking about Gaza Strip or Ukraine, I can appreciate Trump's position in terms of converting the arguments to let's do business together. I've always been in favor. I've stated myself. I think that's great, but we have to have cultural appreciation of each other. That takes time. We have to.
Right.
It can't be just business. Business is a great way to get to know each other, but there has to be. First of all, we cannot be going in or continuing into this future, coming weeks and months, under the pall of this European policy destroying Russia in order to save your economy.
That's exactly right. And you can't do it that way. You're exactly
Well,
right.
you know, they think they can still steal the Russian assets, and it's all going to be real simple, easy as pie. No, they're going to wind up getting themselves blown up, and the whole world in a new game, terrible game. Um, these points about a misunderstanding between Russian and Ukrainian capabilities, Europe's role here. In fact, there is this uh, other perception that the only route through this situation for Russia to disintegrate. And how in the hell are the Russians supposed to think about this?
Exactly, right? So
You know,
it's just
China, as soon as something becomes an existential threat to Russia, first of all, whoever tries to do it is going to find out they haven't taken everything out. And Russia will be in a position in which, if there is a direct conflict, well, there's another thing. I mentioned, the Orishniks are an interesting item. They can carry nukes. They're a low-level ballistic missile that can have variable speed and trajectory and can very, very dependably deliver nuclear weapons where they need to go. Another consideration is something that's closer to the concept of the neutron bomb, which if you can get some graphene capacitors and the right high explosives together with enough impact velocity, you may be able to get fusion and impact fusion. And in that case, you're going to have exceptionally small, but still very large, very small thermonuclear, scale, but say a fraction of a kiloton or maybe kiloton range explosions, uh, which may not necessarily trigger nuclear confrontation, but yet are thermonuclear bombs and extremely potent, much larger than any chemical bomb, much more lightweight, into battle. This would be a first strike strategic item. Now, there are some important technical considerations in its design, and there would probably have to be a few ounces of U-235 involved, more specific, but would be a fission fusion device, but primarily fusion, and the thing is very small, much smaller than any normal critical mass that you would see in a nuclear, accepted nuclear weapon. And so you can actually, Russia, or for that matter, we, use these devices without necessarily triggering a nuclear war, but yet completely decimating the targets.
yes.
Now, this would take development time, and to be honest with you, why in the hell are we talking about building nuclear weapons when we need to be talking about solving these problems? Of course, we need to understand what we're up against and what may be being discussed. When they be helpful us if you don't. So that's the rationale. My apologies.
I agree. I agree. Well, Steve, we'll wrap up right here. I really want to thank you, though.
Man, it's almost been time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this will help people to better understand where we're headed. Because we have two different directions we can go in. The people that are listening around the world, which they listen all over the world on this broadcast, especially in Europe, um, we have a choice. We can bring about peace. We can demand that and try to do something to change it. I know that I've got good friends over in Ukraine, and one good friend of mine, he told me, he said he's so irritated with the ministers. He said Zelensky brought all these ministers in at one point and set them down and told them what they needed to do, what they were planning on doing. He said not one of them stood up and said, why are we killing our neighbors? Why are we killing Ukrainians? Why are we getting involved in this? We should be making peace with one another instead.
One of the more intelligent questions. One last thing. Uh, you know, as virtually all Europeans, Russians, for that matter, Ukrainians, Americans, war.
No,
This war was by the people who were in power. Now, one thing worth mentioning. Armstrong's codes are very sensitive to sociopolitical, socioeconomic issues. One of them is the shift from public to private. And that is that we're going to see the collapse of many governments. Well, boy, we sure have good reason for it. And so it's time for AFD to rise and raise its German identity. For the Ukrainians to have their identity, have a way to end this war that's reasonable for them, and for the Russians not to have to be in fear of NATO's neocons agendas when none of those serve our interests as Americans or Europeans. European people need, we need a Marie Antoinette moment with these leaders, so-called leaders, who are not doing nothing but taking orders from an old order who wants to keep its power when it is no longer appropriate. So this needs to be discussed. I'm so glad to get with you on these things. We've really covered a lot. It's really maybe too much of a waterfront. It may be confusing. My apologies again.
Well, it's a good thing, Stephen. What I'll probably do is put maybe about 5 or 10 minutes of our conversation near the end here that's kind of impactful. Place it at the beginning there for people to hear that and say, now you need to follow though, because it's kind of like a historical walk through how we got to this point. And but this is where we're going if we don't make some serious changes. So I just encourage people, period, to listen to it, take things into account, and anything you can do to help facilitate bringing about a peace in your region of the world, do it. Get active, be involved.
Let's talk about it. We are privileged to wear this little bit of stardust in this little limited dimension that we call human life.
Yes,
Blessing. It's a gift that we waste so easily. I don't mean to facile or naive, but I think we need to define civilization differently than we have. People need to rise up and say, hey, let's stick together while we can, talk more about this, and get toward the solutions.
that's exactly right. Thank you, Steve, for coming on with me, and
Pleasure to be.
thank you guys for listening. Steve, do you publish anywhere else besides we're on John's website?
I haven't been for a long time.
You
I
should
used to
you
publish.
should consider Substack. You really should.
Maybe it's just there's time considering. I used to publish a thing, Jane Reggington. We had a falling out several years ago. We can talk about that some other time if you want. On climate issues. No, not at the moment. But sure, it'd be nice to engage in some meaningful conversation with people who would like to grapple this and maybe redefine our world more quickly than we might have thought.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I appreciate you so much. I always do. Always when you'd come on John's program, I'd like to kind of egg you on and stuff. And so, oh gosh. Anyway, thank you again.
Really special. Maybe we can find some other friends that like to put their heads into this.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you. Guys, if you want, just Steve, is there any way people could contact you if they want to try to contact you, or you want me to just to pass it on to them or to you, or what?
Well, there is email, as long as the bots can get it. You know what? If somebody expresses an interest, you're welcome. They're welcome to. You go ahead and channel it through email. It's probably the best.
Okay, we can do that then. Okay, so yeah, if you want to talk to Steve O'Neill, just send me an email at Stephen@IsraeliNewsLive.org and put in there, please contact Steve O'Neill, and I will forward your email to him. So anyway, thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Steve, for coming on. And hang on just a second, Steve, as I close this out.